Have you ever imagined standing alone in the Arctic night? A blizzard screaming around you? Wolf tracks circling just beyond the snowlight? Tonight, you won't face that fear to be shocked, but to feel it gently, safely, as we drift into a true survival story designed to calm your mind and guide you softly towards sleep. Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a world where sound freezes before it travels, where your breath becomes the loudest thing you own, and where the dark is not a metaphor but a physical presence pressing against your eyes. You are standing at the edge of the Arctic, boots sinking into powder so dry it squeaks like styrofoam, and you already sense that this is not a place that cares whether you are brave or prepared. You probably won't survive this, at least not without help, patience, and a little luck. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in Yakutia in eastern Siberia, a region so cold that winter feels less like a season and more like a long-term condition. The air is sharp, metallic, almost blue in the way it bites the inside of your nose. You are not alone, though it feels that way. Somewhere nearby is a woman who has already lost more than you can imagine. A widow, wrapped in layers of fur and quiet resilience. Her life narrowed down to one simple goal: make it through the night. Arctic survival stories often focus on explorers with notebooks and flags, but this one belongs to people who never plan to be remembered. The blizzard arrives without ceremony. One moment the land is flat and readable, the next it folds inward, erased by wind-driven snow. You learn quickly that Arctic storms don't roar like movie tempests. They hiss and whisper, like the world telling secrets you're not meant to hear. Mainstream history tells us that Yakutia holds the coldest permanently inhabited settlements on Earth, with temperatures dropping below -60 degrees Celsius. That fact alone sounds impressive, but standing here, you realize numbers are useless comfort. Cold is not a statistic, it is a presence. You pull your hood tighter, and here's your first small, slightly absurd realization. Eyelashes freeze together. It's annoying, uncomfortable, and just funny enough to remind you that even in deadly conditions, the human body finds new ways to complain. This is one of those quirky details Arctic survivors often mention, right alongside beards turning into icicles and the strange joy of successfully bending a frozen spoon. You file it away because humor, even thin humor, keeps panic from settling in. The widow moves with slow certainty. She does not rush, because rushing wastes heat and breath. Her husband died last winter. How exactly is a story people still argue over, because Arctic deaths blur into the cold itself. Historians still argue whether most solitary winter deaths in Yakutia were caused by exposure alone, or by a cascade of exhaustion, hunger, and small decision errors that added up over days. Out here, causes don't line up neatly. They overlap like snowdrifts. You follow her lead, stepping where she steps, because drifting even a few meters off course can mean losing landmarks forever. The landscape has no trees tall enough to guide you, no mountains close enough to anchor your sense of direction. Snow and sky blend into a single pale surface, and your inner ear starts lying to you. This is a known phenomenon. Whiteout conditions can trick the brain into feeling level when you're actually walking downhill or in circles. It's like your balance system decided to take the night off. Very professional of it. As the wind intensifies, sound changes. It becomes flatter, swallowed almost instantly. You shout, and the sound feels as if it never fully leaves your mouth. The widow glances back, not annoyed, just checking. Talking wastes energy. Words freeze. This is one reason many Arctic cultures value silence, not as mysticism but as practicality. Mainstream anthropology often notes that Yakut oral traditions are rich, but daily speech in winter is minimal. You talk when it matters. The wolves come later. For now, they are only an idea, a possibility that lives at the edge of your awareness. Yakutia is home to some of the hardiest wolf populations on Earth. Animals that thrive where engines fail and metal snaps. There's a fringe but persistent belief that wolves in extreme cold are more aggressive toward humans, though evidence suggests the opposite. Historians still argue whether increased wolf sightings during harsh winters reflect true aggression or simply overlapping survival paths. When food is scarce, everyone uses the same roads. Your hands ache despite thick mittens. This is another unpleasant lesson. Cold doesn't always announce itself with pain. Sometimes it arrives as numbness, a deceptive calm. The widow checks your fingers anyway, because experience has taught her that comfort is not the same as safety. She taps your knuckles, nods once, and keeps moving. You feel oddly reassured by her efficiency. There is no drama here, no speeches, just motion. You think about fire. Everyone does. Fire is the fantasy solution to cold. But here, it is fragile, temperamental, and often more trouble than it's worth. In high winds, a flame is a liability. Still, humans have used fire in Arctic conditions for thousands of years, often burning animal fat or carefully dried moss. A quirky tidbit archaeologists love to mention is that some Siberian groups use stones heated in fires and then carried them inside clothing as portable warmth. It's basically the world's least convenient hot water bottle. The widow scans the ground for subtle changes in snow texture. You learn that snow is not just snow. There is hard-packed wind crust, soft powder, and dangerous hollow areas where drifts hide air pockets. Step wrong, and you sink, wasting precious energy pulling yourself free. This is not a heroic struggle. It's tedious, exhausting, and deeply uncinematic. If survival movies showed more of this, they'd be about 4 hours long and mostly silent. Critics would call them brave but unwatchable. As night deepens, the cold sharpens. You notice how your thoughts slow, stretching out like long shadows. This is hypothermia's early gift. Not pain, but confusion. Modern studies confirm what Arctic peoples always knew. Cold impairs judgment long before it shuts down the body. Historians still argue whether some legendary mystical visions, reported in polar survival accounts, were spiritual experiences, or simply cold-induced hallucinations. Either way, they felt real to the people who saw them. The widow finally stops. Not because it's safe, but because moving farther is riskier than staying put. This decision, when to stop, is one of the hardest in Arctic survival. Too early and you freeze. Too late and you collapse. She chooses a shallow depression shaped by old wind patterns, just enough to break the gusts. You help pack snow around the edges, your movements slow and deliberate. This is labor, but it's quiet labor, the kind that steadies your breathing. You think of wolves again because the mind circles familiar fears when tired. Somewhere out there, they move in loose coordination, their bodies designed for this exact cold. Wolves don't shiver the way you do. Their fur traps air in ways synthetic jackets can only dream of. Fun fact, a wolf's paws have specialized blood flow that reduces heat loss, essentially built-in thermal management. You wiggle your toes, mildly jealous. The widow listens. She always listens. You copy her, tilting your head slightly, trying to separate wind noise from meaning. There it is, a distant howl stretched thin by the storm. Not close, not far. A reminder rather than a threat. Despite popular belief, wolves rarely attack groups, and they are cautious around humans. Still, the sound tightens something in your chest. Fear, yes, but also awe. You are not alone in this dark. You settle in, knees tucked, back against packed snow. This is not comfort. It is containment. You focus on breathing, slow and even, because panic burns calories faster than movement. The widow hums, barely audible. It's an old melody, passed down without a name. Music here is not entertainment. It's timing, reassurance. A way to keep the mind from wandering into worst-case scenarios. Think of it as the original survival podcast. As minutes stretch, you become acutely aware of your body's small rebellions. Your nose runs. Your jaw stiffens. At one point, you wonder if it would be nice to take a nap, which is your brain waving a small red flag. You gently shake your head, because sleeping in these conditions without proper insulation is a one-way decision. Arctic lore is full of warnings about the warm sleep, a seductive calm that precedes freezing. Historians still argue how much of this is mythologized, but everyone agrees it's dangerous. The widow nudges you, offers a strip of frozen meat. It is hard as wood, flavorless, but it's fuel. Chewing it feels like a workout. You laugh quietly at the absurdity of working this hard just to eat. One of your 3 jokes for the night surfaces. This is the only diet where your food fights back harder than you do. The widow gives you a look that might be amusement, might be fatigue. You'll take it. Time loses shape. You count breaths, then stop counting because numbers drift. The storm continues its patient work, reshaping the land grain by grain. This is something explorers wrote about often, the sense that the Arctic is alive, not in a mystical way but as a system constantly adjusting. Snow moves like sand, cold like water. You are just another object in the flow. Eventually, the wind eases a fraction. Not enough to celebrate, but enough to notice. This is hope in the Arctic. Incremental, quiet, easily missed. You hold on to it anyway. The widow shifts, testing her legs, preparing for what comes next. Survival is not one big victory. It's a series of small refusals to give up. You sit there, wolves somewhere beyond sight, blizzard slowly tiring itself out, and you realize something important. This story is not about conquering nature. It's about cooperating with it, listening, yielding when necessary. The widow understands this instinctively. You are still learning. As the storm loosens its grip, you remain still, conserving warmth, waiting for the next decision point. Night is not over, but you are still here. And for now, in Yakutia, that counts as success. The storm has loosened its grip just enough for memory to creep in. And as you sit beside the widow, wrapped in shared silence, you sense that this night is not her first negotiation with loss. The Arctic has a way of pulling stories out slowly, the way frost pulls heat from skin, patiently without asking permission. You don't ask her about her husband. Out here, questions feel heavy. But as she adjusts her fur-lined hood and shifts closer to block the wind, the story arrives anyway, carried on the low rhythm of her voice. You learn that last winter was worse than this one. Colder, longer, meaner. Her husband left their settlement with 2 others to check traps along a familiar route. This is a mainstream historical reality in Yakutia. Even into the 20th century, winter trapping remained essential for food and trade, despite its risks. Men and women vanished along these routes often enough that communities developed rituals not just for mourning, but for waiting. You picture that wait now, stretching day by day, the sky never quite brightening. She tells you they found his sled weeks later. Empty, upright. That detail matters. An overturned sled means accident. An upright one suggests intention, a choice made somewhere in the white. Historians still argue whether many Arctic disappearances were the result of sudden storms or of people choosing to leave their gear behind in confusion or despair. The line between accident and decision blurs when the cold gets involved. As she speaks, you notice how she never says his name. This is not avoidance. It's protection. In some Yakut traditions, names of the dead are spoken sparingly in winter, a quirky but enduring belief meant to keep spirits from wandering back in the long dark. Anthropologists debate whether this custom was spiritual or psychological, whether it truly warded off ghosts, or simply helped the living focus on survival. Either way, it stuck. The widow explains how the search unfolded. You imagine it vividly. Neighbors fanning out across frozen rivers, eyes scanning for unnatural shapes in the snow. Searching in Arctic conditions is less about speed and more about pattern recognition. A shadow that doesn't belong. A line too straight to be natural. You realize how exhausting that kind of attention must be, how it drains the mind faster than walking ever could. She pauses, listening to the wind, then continues. They never found his body. This is more common than you expect. In extreme cold, bodies don't decay the way they do elsewhere. They disappear into snowdrifts, ice layers, and animal paths. Wolves, foxes, even birds take part in this quiet erasure. Despite popular fears, wolves rarely scavenge fresh human remains unless desperation forces them. Historians still argue how often wolves were truly responsible versus blamed because they were visible, convenient symbols of the wild. You feel a strange mix of fear and relief at that thought. Fear because wolves are real and near. Relief because the Arctic itself is the greater force here, indifferent and thorough. The widow shifts the conversation gently, as if sensing the weight settling on you. She talks about the first night alone after the search ended. That night, she says, was colder than this one. Not in temperature, but in feeling. You understand immediately. Loss strips warmth from the world. Even the fire feels smaller. This is not poetry. It's physiology. Grief raises stress hormones, which can actually reduce cold tolerance. Modern science backs up what Arctic widows learned the hard way. She describes lying awake, listening for footsteps she knew would not come. You picture the endless night pressing against the walls of a small shelter, darkness pooling in corners. There's a dark joke here, one you don't say out loud. Insomnia is much less glamorous when the alternative is freezing to death. You keep it to yourself. One joke saved for later. Instead, you focus on how she survived that winter. Not heroically, not dramatically. She followed routines. She woke, she checked traps, she mended clothing. Mainstream history often celebrates Arctic explorers, but survival literature emphasizes routine as the real lifesaver. Doing normal things convinces the brain that the future still exists. She teaches you this now, even without trying. She checks your boots, tightens a loose tie, taps snow from your shoulders. Care as habit. You realize that grief did not make her reckless. It made her precise. Historians still argue whether long-term Arctic survivors developed resilience because of trauma or simply alongside it. Cause and effect are tangled here. The wind picks up again, and the conversation thins. Your mind drifts to the idea of wolves, partly because fear is familiar, partly because it's easier than thinking about human absence. The widow mentions them casually, noting that after her husband vanished, wolves were seen closer to the settlement. This fueled rumors, of course. People needed a shape for their fear, a face. Wolves provided one. Yet she does not hate them. This surprises you. She explains that wolves follow weakness, not malice. In winters when people struggle, wolves struggle too. Their paths cross more often, that's all. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some Yakut elders believed wolves acted as reluctant guides, their tracks sometimes leading humans to game or safer terrain. Scholars debate whether this belief influenced behavior or simply reframed coincidence as meaning. You listen, feeling the story wrap around you like another layer of fur. This is not just her past. It's a lesson being handed over. Loss is part of the Arctic contract. You don't sign it willingly, but you live by it anyway. Your legs begin to ache, a dull warning that stillness has limits. The widow notices before you say anything. She gestures for small movements, wiggling toes, flexing fingers. This is another mainstream survival fact. Micro-movements help maintain circulation without burning too much energy. You comply, grateful for direction. Decision-making feels heavier tonight. She returns briefly to her husband, this time with a practical note. He was careful, experienced. This matters because it dismantles a comforting myth that skill guarantees safety. Historians still argue whether experience truly reduced Arctic mortality or simply prolonged exposure to risk. You don't like the answer, whichever way it leans. A second howl drifts through the air, closer now. Not close enough to panic, but close enough to acknowledge. Your heart rate bumps up. Here comes your second joke, whispered more to yourself than anyone. At least the wolves are punctual. Grief shows up whenever it wants. The widow huffs softly. That was a laugh. You count it as a win. The storm begins to thin again, and with it, the heaviness of the story settles into something steadier. You realize that this night is not about reliving her loss, but about understanding how it reshaped her. She did not leave. She did not surrender the land. She adapted. As the cold hums around you, you take that lesson in quietly. Survival here is not defiance. It's acceptance with boundaries. You can't beat the Arctic, but you can listen to it, learn its rhythms, and carry on even when it takes something from you. You sit there together, two silhouettes against the snow, wolves somewhere beyond sight, loss acknowledged but not indulged. The night continues, but so do you. And in this place, that balance between remembering and moving forward is what keeps people alive. The blizzard rebuilds itself around you, piece by piece, like a machine restarting after a pause. You feel it first in the pressure against your ears, a subtle tightening as wind speed changes direction. This is the anatomy of an Arctic storm, something you learn not from textbooks but from how your body reacts. Snow no longer falls downward. It slides sideways, upward, occasionally straight into your face with personal enthusiasm. You tuck your chin and remind yourself that blinking is now a conscious decision. Blizzards here are not just weather events. They are systems. Mainstream meteorology explains that Arctic blizzards form when extreme temperature differences collide, creating powerful pressure gradients that accelerate wind across flat terrain. In Yakutia, there are few natural barriers, so wind gathers strength like a rumor with no one to stop it. You feel that strength now, pushing against your ribs, testing your balance. Standing upright feels optional and not in a fun yoga way. The widow reads the storm the way sailors read waves. She watches how snow curls around your shelter, noting whether it scours or piles. Scouring means exposed ground ahead. Piling means potential insulation. This is knowledge passed down quietly, refined through mistakes no one brags about. Historians still argue whether such environmental literacy was instinctual or systematically taught within Arctic families. Either way, it works. Your sense of time dissolves again. Blizzards distort duration as much as direction. 10 minutes can feel like an hour. An hour can disappear entirely. This is partly psychological, but there's a physical component too. Cold slows nerve signals slightly, altering perception. You find this fascinating in a detached way, as if your brain is narrating a documentary about itself. You decide this is either a healthy coping mechanism or the early stages of cabin fever, minus the cabin. The wind finds gaps in your clothing, probing like curious fingers. You adjust layers, remembering the widow's earlier lesson. Air is your real insulation, not fabric. Trapped air warms, moves slowly, buys you time. There's a quirky survival tidbit you recall. Some Arctic travelers stuff dry grass or even paper into clothing to increase insulation. This basically DIY padding, the original life hack. You mentally apologize to every office printer you've ever taken for granted. Snow begins to accumulate along the shelter's edge, and this is good news. Snow counterintuitively insulates. Fresh snow traps air efficiently, creating a barrier against wind. Mainstream Arctic survival guides emphasize using snow as a building material, not an obstacle. You watch the widow gently reinforce the drift, careful not to compress it too much. Compact snow loses its insulating properties. This is engineering at the level of frozen patience. Your breathing fogs the small space, and moisture becomes a new concern. Sweat is dangerous here. Moisture conducts heat away from the body faster than dry air. You consciously slow your movements, despite the urge to fidget. This is another paradox of cold survival. You must move enough to stay warm, but not so much that you sweat. It's like trying to toast bread without burning it, except the bread is you. The storm shifts pitch, rising to a higher whine. The widow stiffens slightly. This sound means finer snow particles, more abrasive, more likely to infiltrate seams and eyelashes. You squint, tears freezing instantly at the corners of your eyes. Joke number 1 sneaks in. You've officially reached the climate where crying requires a defrost cycle. You keep it internal. Humor, you've learned, works best when shared selectively. Visibility drops to almost nothing. This is the classic whiteout, where sky and ground merge into a single blank surface. Orientation becomes guesswork. In such conditions, people have been known to walk in circles without realizing it, guided by a dominant leg or subtle wind pressure. Historians still argue whether famous cases of wandering until collapse were due to neurological effects or simple disorientation compounded by fatigue. Standing still suddenly feels like a bold strategic choice. The widow tests the air again, then lowers her head. You mimic her posture, reducing your profile. Wind speed increases dramatically near the ground due to surface friction effects. This is basic physics, but knowing it intellectually doesn't make crouching any less uncomfortable. Your knees protest. Your back complains. You promise them a stern talking to later, assuming everyone survives the night. Sound becomes strange again. The blizzard dampens everything except itself. You can't hear your own heartbeat, which is unsettling, because it's usually so eager to make itself known during stressful moments. Instead, There's just the endless rush of snow, like static tuned to maximum volume. Some survivors report auditory hallucinations in these conditions. Voices, music, footsteps. Historians still argue whether these experiences were stress-induced or caused by sensory deprivation. You hear nothing extra, and you're oddly grateful. Silence is complicated enough. The widow reaches into her clothing and produces a small object. A strip of leather with notches cut into it. She fingers them absently. This is a timekeeping charm, each notch representing a familiar interval. Roughly the time it takes to boil water, to walk between landmarks, to warm hands safely. It's not precise, but it's grounding. Quirky detail. Some Arctic communities use songs of fixed length for the same purpose, essentially musical timers. You briefly consider writing a pop song exactly 3 minutes long for survival reasons, then discard the idea. The blizzard presses on. You feel the cold seep deeper, into joints, into thoughts. Your mind tries to simplify problems, reduce everything to immediate needs. This narrowing of focus is adaptive, but dangerous if it becomes too narrow. You consciously widen your attention. Check toes, fingers, breathing, surroundings. Feels like juggling in mittens, but you manage. Joke number 2 surfaces as you notice ice forming on your scarf. Congratulations, you've become a walking freezer burn demonstration. Again, internal. You're learning restraint. The storm's intensity peaks, then plateaus. This is another pattern the widow recognizes. Arctic blizzards often maintain a steady maximum for hours before easing. The trick is surviving the plateau without burning resources. You ration movement, thought, even emotion. Everything becomes deliberate. You remember something you read long ago. In extreme cold, calories are heat. Fat becomes precious, not feared. Historically, Arctic diets emphasized high-fat foods for this reason. Butter, seal oil, marrow, energy-dense, and warming. Modern nutrition debates look very different when your life depends on metabolic efficiency. Historians still argue how much diet alone influenced Arctic survival versus broader cultural practices. Right now, you just wish for a cheeseburger with existential sincerity. The widow adjusts the shelter one last time as snow thickens around you. The blizzard is now doing some of the work, sealing gaps, smoothing edges. Nature, briefly, is cooperating. You settle into the rhythm of waiting, a skill as real as walking or hunting. Joke number 3 arrives softly. If patience were a competitive sport, the Arctic would host the World Championships. You almost smile. As the storm sustains itself, you realize you're no longer fighting it moment by moment. You're existing within it. This shift matters. Panic drains heat faster than wind. Acceptance, oddly, conserves it. The blizzard continues its careful assault. But you are still here, still breathing, still thinking. You understand its anatomy now, not just how it forms, but how it feels, how it tests, how it eventually moves on. And when it does, it will leave behind a reshaped world, one you'll have to read all over again. For now, you wait, wrapped in snow and silence, learning the storm from the inside. When the blizzard finally loosens enough to let thought move freely again, you arrive at the quietest, heaviest question Arctic nights can ask. Do you stay, or do you move? This is not a dramatic fork in the road. There is no signpost, no inner voice announcing the correct answer. There is only cold math and intuition, both unreliable in different ways. The widow does not rush this moment. Neither do you. Staying means conserving energy, using the shelter you've slowly coaxed into existence, trusting that the storm will continue to weaken. Moving means risking exposure, but also the chance of reaching better protection before cold debt compounds. Mainstream survival manuals often repeat a simple rule. If you have shelter, don't abandon it. Yet historians still argue whether this rule emerged from evidence or from survivorship bias. Those who stayed and lived wrote the manuals, while those who left and vanished left no footnotes. The widow tests the wind again, lifting a handful of snow and letting it fall. It drops mostly straight down now, no longer flung sideways with malice. This matters. Wind chill, not temperature alone, kills quickly. Even a small reduction buys time. She nods more to herself than to you. Staying is winning for now. But staying is not passive. Shelter in the Arctic is not a place. It's a process. Snow continues to pile against the drift, and you and the widow shape it carefully, thickening walls, smoothing edges so the wind slides rather than punches. Snow architecture is a real discipline here, passed down through observation and failure. Compact too much and you lose insulation. Leave it loose and it collapses. You work slowly, fingers stiff, movements economical. There's a quirky historical tidbit that surfaces as you work. Early Arctic travelers sometimes carried small saws specifically for cutting snow blocks, treating snow like stone. Entire villages were once built seasonally from compacted snow, warmer inside than many wooden structures. It's one of those facts that sounds like a trick until you're crouched behind a drift, grateful for every trapped pocket of air. As you labor, the alternative presses in mentally. If you left now, where would you go? The landscape beyond your immediate bubble has been rewritten by the storm. Familiar contours erased, new drifts piled where none existed before. Whiteout conditions may have lifted, but depth perception remains unreliable. You could walk toward what looks like a rise and find yourself descending instead. In the Arctic, walking downhill can be more dangerous than climbing because cold air pools in low ground. The widow shares a short memory, offered without drama. Once, years ago, she left shelter too early, convinced movement would save her. She walked for hours, burning calories she could not replace, only to return, by luck, to the same place she started. This is not uncommon. Historians still argue how many Arctic deaths resulted from this looping phenomenon, where people walk themselves into exhaustion within sight of safety. The mind insists progress is happening. The land disagrees. You decide together to improve what you have rather than chase what you might find. This decision feels heavy, but also relieving. Certainty, even temporary certainty, is warming. You block a low opening, leaving just enough space to breathe. Airflow matters. Carbon dioxide buildup is a real risk in snow shelters. Mainstream survival facts emphasize ventilation holes, often maintained with sticks or tools. You keep one clear, checking it obsessively. Paranoia has its uses. Inside the shelter, the light changes. Snow filters what little ambient glow exists, turning darkness into a muted blue-gray. Sound drops further. It's oddly peaceful, like being underwater. You notice your shoulders relax despite yourself. Joke number 1 slips in quietly. Congratulations. You've checked into the Arctic's most exclusive minimalist hotel. Amenities include silence and existential reflection. You almost smile. The widow produces a small candle stub, shielding the flame carefully as she lights it. Fire again, but controlled, minimal. The candle's heat is negligible, but its psychological effect is enormous. A single point of light shrinks the world into something manageable. She places it where melting won't drip onto clothing. You watch, reminded that even tiny mistakes matter here. There's debate among historians and survival experts about the value of light in extreme cold. Some argue it's a waste of oxygen and fuel. Others note its role in maintaining alertness and morale. Historians still argue whether morale preservation had measurable survival benefits or merely made the experience more bearable. Sitting here, watching the flame flicker, you don't care which camp wins. It helps. You adjust your posture, knees drawn in, spine curved to reduce exposed surface area. This position is uncomfortable, but efficient. Curling conserves heat like a human comma. Your muscles protest and you answer with small shifts. Too much movement risks sweating. Too little invites stiffness. Balance becomes the night's theme. Outside, the storm continues its retreat, though you can't see it. You infer it from the quiet. Silence in the Arctic is never absolute, but its texture changes. The constant hiss fades to a distant sigh. You mark the time mentally, using the widow's leather notches as reference. Enough intervals pass to suggest the worst is over. Not gone, just no longer peaking. Joke number 2 surfaces as your stomach growls. Loud in the hush. Even your digestive system wants reassurance. You suppress a laugh. Hunger is a reminder you're alive, but also that reserves are finite. The widow offers another strip of food, smaller this time. Rationing is careful, almost tender. You chew slowly, aware that digestion itself generates heat, biology pulling its weight. You talk quietly now, just a few words exchanged. Speech feels safer, like testing ice with a toe before committing. You discuss the morning, if there will be one. In polar regions, morning is a flexible concept. Daylight may not arrive in the usual sense, but light will change. That change is the signal to reassess. The question of moving will return then, sharper but better informed. You'll look for storm markers, drift orientation, snow hardness, wind scars. These signs tell stories. Mainstream Arctic navigation relies on them more than compasses, which can be unreliable near magnetic anomalies common in Siberia. Historians still argue how often early explorers trusted instruments over local knowledge, and how often that trust proved fatal. You feel fatigue deepen, a heavy blanket settling over thought. This is the dangerous part of staying. Stillness invites sleep. You counter it with micromovements, mental checklists, listening. The widow hums again, low and steady. Music as vigilance. It works. Joke number 3 drifts in, almost drowsy. If sleep were currency, you'd be rich enough to retire somewhere tropical. You banish the image gently. Focus. Minutes stretch, then thin. The candle shortens. You snuff it before it burns too low, preserving air. Darkness returns, but it's friendlier now, familiar. You've chosen to stay, and staying has chosen you back. This shelter is not permanent. It's a pause, a negotiated ceasefire with the cold. But it's enough. For this hour, this stretch of night, you are not walking yourself into danger. You are holding ground, conserving warmth, letting the Arctic pass over rather than through you. The decision stands. Shelter over movement, patience over panic. And in Yakutia, tonight, that choice keeps you alive. The first thing you notice about the wolves is not their sound, but their absence of it. After hours of wind and shifting snow, the sudden quiet feels intentional, like a room going silent when someone important enters. You sense movement before you see anything. Pressure changes, a subtle tightening of the air beyond the shelter. The widow's posture shifts almost imperceptibly. This is the moment her body has been expecting. Yellow eyes appear at the edge of visibility, then another pair, then another. Not close, not rushing, just present. Yakutia wolves are larger than most, built for endurance rather than speed, their bodies lean and efficient. Mainstream zoology tells us these wolves can travel over 30 miles a day in winter, conserving energy through steady pacing rather than bursts. Watching them now, you believe it. They move like they have nowhere else to be. Your heart thumps, loud enough that you're briefly convinced they can hear it. The widow does not reach for anything resembling a weapon. She does not shout. She does not flinch. Instead, she sits taller, making herself visible without being aggressive. You follow her lead, because this is not the moment for improvisation. Wolves read posture the way humans read faces. There's a persistent myth that wolves stalk humans as prey. Historians still argue how much of this belief was shaped by folklore and fear rather than documented behavior. In reality, healthy wolves avoid adult humans whenever possible. Most recorded attacks occurred under extreme conditions, rabies, starvation, or human encroachment. Tonight, the wolves are hungry, yes, but not desperate. There is a difference, and it matters. The pack spreads slightly, forming a loose arc. This is not an encirclement. It's assessment. They are mapping you, your shelter, your stillness. You realize with a jolt that they are curious. Curiosity feels scarier than aggression, because it's harder to predict. Joke number 1 flickers through your mind. Congratulations, you've become a pop-up exhibit in the Arctic Wildlife Museum. You suppress a smile. This is not the time to radiate mixed signals. The widow murmurs a few words under her breath. Not a prayer exactly, more like a reminder to herself. She explains quietly that wolves respect consistency. Sudden movements trigger chase instincts. Calm signals uncertainty, but not weakness. This aligns with mainstream wildlife guidance, which emphasizes maintaining eye contact without staring, standing ground without advancing. You do exactly that, even though every muscle wants to curl inward. One wolf steps closer, placing its paws carefully, testing the snow's crust. You notice how silent it is. Wolves have thick pads and fur between their toes, adaptations that muffle sound and reduce heat loss. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Their paws also help distribute weight, preventing them from breaking through crusted snow as easily as humans do. You glance at your boots and feel personally judged. The wolf stops, head tilted. His breath fogs faintly in the cold. This is not menace. It's evaluation. You are being categorized. Food? Threat? Obstacle? Something else? The widow holds steady. She has seen this before. Wolves pass through human spaces all winter, tracing overlapping survival routes. Conflict is rare because both sides understand the cost of injury. You become aware of another sound, the soft crunch of snow farther off. More wolves. The pack is larger than you first thought, but still not enormous. 6, maybe 7. Enough to hunt effectively. Enough to be confident. But they don't advance as a group. That restraint tells you something important. They are not hunting you. Historians still argue whether wolves in Yakutia developed learned avoidance behaviors specifically toward humans due to centuries of coexistence, or whether avoidance is simply a universal trait reinforced by occasional lethal encounters. Either way, the result is the same. They watch, they wait, they decide. Joke number 2 bubbles up as you realize how long this standoff is lasting. This is the most intense staring contest you've ever lost without blinking. You keep your face neutral. Inner comedy only. The widow shifts slightly, placing a hand on the snow between you. This is deliberate. She is grounding herself, signaling presence. Some Arctic cultures believe touching the ground during wolf encounters reinforced human belonging to the land, though scholars debate whether this belief influenced outcomes or merely provided psychological steadiness. Either way, it steadies you too. Your breathing slows. One wolf lowers its head to sniff the air. Catches the scent of food, of course. Dried meat, human scent, candle residue. But it also smells something else. Density. Human groups smell different than lone travelers. Even 2 people register as more complex, more risky. Wolves calculate risk constantly. Injury equals death in winter. The pack leader, if that concept even applies in such a loose formation, turns away first. This is subtle, almost dismissive. One by one, the others follow, melting back into the dimness. No sudden departure. No drama. Just a decision reached and executed. You don't move until they are gone from sight and sound. Even then, you wait longer. Wolves have excellent hearing. Lingering stillness costs nothing. When you finally exhale fully, it feels like releasing a held breath you didn't realize you'd been carrying for hours. The widow nods once. Not triumphant. Just acknowledging that the moment passed. You feel an unexpected swell of respect. Not just for her, but for the wolves themselves. They did not attack. They did not test you further. They assessed, then chose a different path. There's dignity in that. You whisper a question, careful not to break the quiet too sharply. She answers just as softly, explaining that wolves often follow storm edges, hunting animals weakened by exposure. Your shelter, imperfect as it is, presents effort without guarantee. Wolves prefer certainty. Mainstream ecological studies support this. Predators conserve energy by selecting prey with the highest success-to-effort ratio. You are inefficient prey. Joke number 3 surfaces gently. For once, being inconvenient works in your favor. You almost smile again. The encounter leaves behind a charged calm. Your senses feel sharper, your awareness widened. This is the paradox of fear managed well. It doesn't shrink you. It clarifies. You recheck fingers and toes, mindful that adrenaline can mask numbness. Everything responds. Good. The widow hums again. Slower now. The tunes stretch thin. It's a release, a signal that vigilance can ease. Outside, the wolves are already gone, their tracks filling with drifting snow. By morning, there may be no evidence they were ever there. This too is common. Arctic stories often lack footprints. Historians still argue whether human fear of wolves exceeded the actual danger they posed, especially compared to cold itself. Sitting here, alive and intact, you suspect the answer. The wolves were not the night's true threat. They were a reminder of balance, of shared endurance, of how many lives persist quietly in this frozen dark. You settle back into stillness, shelter intact, decision validated. The Arctic has introduced another of its neighbors, and you have passed without incident. The night continues, but something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer imagining danger everywhere. You have seen it, measured it, and watched it move on. That knowledge warms you more than any fire could. After the wolves fade back into the snow, the night feels strangely hollow, as if a held note has finally been released. You become aware again of smaller sensations, the ache in your knees, the tightness in your jaw, the slow rhythm of breath fogging the air. This is when the widow turns her attention to the fire that barely lives. Because in the Arctic, flame is not a spectacle. It's a negotiation. She does not reach for it immediately. First, she checks the shelter, reinforcing the snow walls where the wolves brushed past, smoothing areas where wind might find purchase again. Only when the space feels settled does she retrieve a tiny bundle from her inner layer. Inside, a sliver of birch bark, darkened with resin, and a twist of dried moss. This is not modern fire-starting romance. This is precision. Mainstream history tells us that fire-making in extreme cold was one of humanity's great adaptations. Archaeological evidence from Siberia shows hearth use dating back tens of thousands of years, even during glacial periods. What those records don't capture is how exhausting fire becomes when the cold is this deep. Fingers stiffen. Sparks die midair. Every attempt costs energy you can't afford to waste. The widow shields the materials with her body, creating a pocket of calmer air. You copy her posture, forming a human windbreak. Cooperation here is literal. She strikes, slowly, deliberately. The spark catches for half a second, then disappears. No frustration, just another attempt. Fire, you learn, responds poorly to impatience. On the third try, the ember holds. It glows, faint but stubborn. The widow feeds it moss, then bark, breathing gently, not blowing, which would cool it too quickly. When a flame finally appears, it is small and unimpressive, like a candle deciding whether it wants to exist. Joke number 1 flickers through your mind. This is the world's most dramatic pilot light. You keep your face neutral. The fire's warmth is psychological before it is physical. You feel it in your chest more than on your skin, a loosening of something clenched too long. The widow places a flat stone near the flame, not directly on it. Stones absorb and radiate heat slowly, extending the fire's usefulness. This technique appears again and again in Arctic survival accounts. Historians still argue whether heated stones significantly increased survival odds or simply made long nights more tolerable. Tonight, tolerable feels like enough. You become acutely aware of oxygen. Fire consumes it, and in a small snow shelter, air is currency. The widow keeps the flame minimal, watching your breath fog and the smoke's behavior. If smoke lingers, ventilation is insufficient. This is why many Arctic fires were built outside shelters, despite the cold. The risk trade-off is constant: warmth versus air. As the stone warms, the widow slides it carefully closer to your feet. Heat where blood vessels run close to the surface matters most. Warming extremities helps circulation everywhere else. This is mainstream physiology, but experiencing it firsthand feels like a small miracle. Your toes prickle, sensation returning. It's not comfortable, but it's alive. She explains quietly that fire is also for the morning. Starting a fire now reduces effort later. Cold deepens overnight. Materials become more brittle, hands slower. Maintaining even a small coal through the night can mean the difference between light and darkness at dawn. There's a quirky detail here. Some Arctic groups carried embers in insulated containers during travel, treating fire as something you keep alive, not recreate. Fire as companion, not tool. The flame wavers as a draft sneaks through the shelter. You adjust snow, sealing the gap. This teamwork feels practiced, even though it's new to you. Crisis accelerates familiarity. You don't talk much. Words feel bulky. Joke number 2 surfaces as you watch the flame's reflection dance on the stone. This is the only campfire where the entertainment is watching a rock warm up. You stifle a chuckle. Humor still works best internally. The widow uses the fire to melt a small amount of snow in a metal cup. Not for drinking, not yet, but to humidify the air slightly. Extremely dry cold can irritate airways, triggering coughing that wastes heat and energy. This is a subtle, advanced tactic, one rarely mentioned in basic survival guides. Historians still argue how much of Arctic survival knowledge remained undocumented because it was considered too obvious by those who lived it. As the steam rises, you feel your throat ease. Breathing becomes less sharp. This tiny comfort feels enormous. You are reminded that survival is not about heroic acts, but about stacking small advantages. Outside, the night deepens. The wolves are gone, but their absence leaves you more alert, not less. Predators teach attention. You listen for new sounds, even as fatigue presses in. The fire's glow becomes an anchor for your focus. You stare at it longer than necessary, not hypnotized, just grateful. The widow feeds the flame once more, then lets it settle. Too much fuel risks flare-ups, sparks, and wasted oxygen. She arranges the stone so it continues radiating warmth even as the flame dims. This is thermal budgeting, and it feels strangely satisfying to participate in. Joke number 3 arrives quietly as you realize how carefully everything is measured. Congratulations, you've entered the Arctic accounting department, where every calorie and ember is audited. You almost smile. Almost. As the fire shrinks, the shelter fills again with blue-gray darkness. But it's different now. Warmer. Softer. You check your body. Fingers responsive, toes tingling, mind clearer. Fire has done its job. Historians still argue whether mastery of fire was the single most important factor in human expansion into cold regions, or whether clothing and social cooperation mattered more. Sitting here, you suspect the answer is unsatisfying to academics. It was all of it, intertwined. Fire alone is nothing without hands to tend it, knowledge to guide it, and restraint to keep it from killing you another way. The widow extinguishes the flame fully, carefully, preserving what little fuel remains. She stores the warm stone where it will continue helping without burning air. Darkness returns, but it no longer feels hostile. Feels earned. You settle back, fire replaced by memory of warmth. A mental echo you cling to as the night stretches on. The Arctic has allowed you this small victory, and you accept it without celebration. In this place, fire is not a triumph. It is a quiet agreement that, for now, you may continue. When the fire's memory fades and the stone cools to a dull, lingering warmth, attention shifts to what has been protecting you all along. The layers pressed against your skin. Clothing in the Arctic is not fashion, not even equipment. It is shelter that moves when you do. The widow understands this deeply, and as the night settles into its long middle stretch, she checks layers the way a mechanic checks an engine. Methodical, unsentimental, precise. She starts with your outer shell, brushing away ice crystals that have formed where breath and drifting snow met fabric. Ice stiffens material, reducing its ability to trap air. This is a mainstream survival fact. Insulation depends on loft, and loft collapses when frozen moisture builds up. You hadn't noticed the stiffness until she points it out. Awareness you're learning is often borrowed from someone else. Beneath the outer layer, she checks seams and ties, tightening where cold air might sneak in. She shows you how even small gaps can create convection currents, pulling warmth out continuously. It's like leaving a window cracked open in winter, except the window is on your spine. Historians still argue whether ancient Arctic clothing designs evolved through trial and error or through intentional experimentation. Looking at her careful adjustments, you suspect both. She moves on to inner layers. Fur against skin, then hide, then woven fabric. In Yakutia, traditional winter clothing often combined reindeer, fox, and wolf fur, each chosen for specific properties. Reindeer fur, hollow and lightweight, traps heat exceptionally well. Wolf fur sheds snow and resists frost buildup. Mainstream anthropology confirms these choices weren't symbolic. They were technical. This is material science without a lab. You flex your arms as she works, noting how bulk restricts movement but increases warmth. There's a balance here. Too much bulk and you fatigue faster. Too little and cold slips in. Joke number 1 surfaces. This is the only wardrobe where slightly inconvenient counts as a feature. You keep quiet, but the thought warms you. The widow explains that clothing must be managed constantly. You don't just put it on and forget it. You vent when moving to prevent sweat, seal up when resting. Sweat is the enemy. Moisture steals heat relentlessly. Historians still argue how many Arctic deaths were accelerated by damp clothing rather than temperature alone. You glance at your cuffs, grateful for earlier restraint. She demonstrates a small adjustment, loosening a tie near the neck to release trapped moisture, then resealing it once the fabric dries slightly. Subtle but effective. You feel the difference almost immediately. Your breathing steadies, chest less constricted. Then there are the extremities. Hands and feet are the first to suffer, because the body sacrifices them to protect core organs. The widow removes your mittens briefly, one hand at a time, checking color and responsiveness. Pink returns quickly. Good. She shows you how to rotate fingers against the palm rather than shaking them, which wastes energy and increases frost risk. Mainstream medical advice aligns with this, though few people practice it until they must. Your boots receive similar attention. She taps the soles, listening to the sound. Hollow means insulation still intact. Solid means ice buildup. One boot sounds slightly off. She kneels, adjusts the lining, redistributing fur to restore loft. This is intimate, practical care, stripped of embarrassment by necessity. Out here, dignity is flexible. She talks about bone and fur with reverence, not sentimentality. Animals provided not just food, but protection. Every part mattered. Quirky tidbit. Some Arctic cultures used fish skin for waterproof outer layers, stitching it carefully to repel moisture. Smelled terrible, apparently, but it worked. You wrinkle your nose reflexively, then remind yourself that smelling bad has never killed anyone. Cold, on the other hand, is very professional about it. Historians still argue whether modern synthetic materials outperform traditional furs in extreme cold. Laboratory tests say yes. Lived experience often says it depends. Synthetics lose insulating power when wet. Fur, paradoxically, performs better as it frosts, because ice forms on the outside, leaving trapped air inside. You glance at the widow's coat, rimmed with frost like a second skin. It is beautiful in a severe way. She adjusts her own clothing last, tightening, smoothing, redistributing weight. Watching her, you realize how automatic these motions are, the result of years of practice. Clothing management is muscle memory here. It's not taught in manuals. It's absorbed through watching elders survive. Joke number 2 drifts in as you consider your own outfit. You've never owned anything so functional and so completely unsuited for a mirror. You let the thought pass. Vanity freezes quickly. As the night deepens, you perform small checks on yourself, mimicking her rhythm. Touch fingers, flex toes, adjust layers. This routine keeps you awake just enough to avoid dangerous drowsiness. It also gives your mind something to hold onto besides fear or fatigue. The widow mentions that her husband used to say clothing was like a second conversation with the cold. If you listened, it told you when to change, when to stop, when to move. If you ignored it, it stopped talking, and then things went wrong. You don't ask how he learned that lesson. Some knowledge arrives late. There's a scholarly debate about whether clothing innovations enabled Arctic settlement or whether social structures mattered more. Historians still argue this point, pointing to cases where well-clothed individuals still perished alone. Sitting here, you suspect clothing keeps you alive only long enough for relationships and decisions to matter. The wind brushes the shelter again, but the layers hold. You feel cocooned, contained. Warmth is not comfort, but it's enough to keep circulation steady. Your mind drifts briefly, images softening at the edges. You pull yourself back with a toe wiggle, a breath count. Joke number 3 arrives gently. If survival had a dress code, this would be it: no refunds, no returns. You almost smile. The widow finishes her checks and settles back, satisfied. Clothing will not save you by itself, but tonight, it's doing its job. Bone, fur, fabric, and habit combine into something stronger than any single piece. You sit there together, wrapped in layers chosen by generations who learned what mattered the hard way. The Arctic presses in, but it cannot reach you easily now. Your shelter holds. Your fire's memory lingers. Your clothing completes the circle. And in this long night, that is enough. Hunger doesn't arrive the way people expect. There's no dramatic stomach growl, no sudden weakness that drops you to your knees. Out here, hunger slips in quietly, like a thought you didn't invite but can't quite dismiss. You notice it first as distraction. Your mind drifts, focus loosens its grip. The widow notices before you do, because she's seen this shape of danger many times. She shifts closer and offers you a small piece of food, no bigger than a thumb. It's frozen solid, dense, unremarkable. You accept it with more gratitude than excitement. In the Arctic, food is not pleasure. It is calibration. How much you eat, how often, and what you eat determines not just energy but clarity. Mainstream physiology tells us that the brain consumes a disproportionate amount of glucose. When intake drops, cognition is one of the first things to suffer. This is why hunger and cold together are so dangerous. Cold demands energy, hunger denies it. Historians still argue whether early Arctic deaths were driven more by caloric deficit or exposure itself. Sitting here, you suspect the truth is unhelpful and circular. You chew slowly, deliberately. Chewing generates heat, stimulates saliva, and gives the brain something to do. The widow nods approval. She explains that eating too much at once can backfire. Digestion pulls blood toward the core, sometimes away from extremities already struggling. Small, steady intake works better. Survival here is about avoiding extremes. As the food dissolves, a strange lightness creeps in. Hunger plays tricks, offering false comfort. Your thoughts feel floaty, unanchored. You catch yourself imagining irrelevant things. Warm kitchens, familiar streets, ordinary inconveniences. This mental drift is common. Some Arctic survivors described it as nostalgia amplified by cold. Historians still argue whether such mental wandering was a coping mechanism or an early symptom of starvation-induced confusion. The widow interrupts your reverie with a quiet question. You answer a little too slowly. She notices. There's no alarm in her eyes, just adjustment. She changes the rhythm, asks you to describe something concrete, nearby. You talk about the texture of the snow wall, the sound of wind shifting. This grounding technique appears in modern psychology, but here it's instinctive. Keeping the mind tethered keeps the body compliant. Hunger sharpens emotion unevenly. Small irritations feel larger. Fatigue deepens. You feel a flicker of annoyance at nothing in particular, then recognize it for what it is. This awareness is crucial. People in extreme conditions sometimes mistake hunger-induced irritability for external threat, escalating conflict, or making poor decisions. Historians still argue how many fatal arguments in survival situations were fueled less by fear and more by depleted blood sugar. You take another small bite, chew, swallow. The widow mirrors you, maintaining parity. Eating together matters. It synchronizes energy, mood, and decision-making. This is a social survival strategy as much as a nutritional one. Quirky detail. Some Arctic groups believed eating alone during hardship invited misfortune. Scholars debate whether this belief reinforced cooperation or simply reflected practical wisdom. Either way, it kept people alive. Time stretches again, but hunger distorts it differently than cold. Minutes feel longer, not shorter. Your body wants resolution, either food or collapse. You deny it both, offering patience instead. Patience is hard currency here. Joke number 1 drifts in, dry and internal. This is the only restaurant where the tasting menu is 1 bite long and still somehow too much. You suppress a smile. Humor burns calories too, but it also keeps the mind engaged. Worth the cost. The widow tells you a brief story chosen carefully. Once, she says, a man in her village survived a storm but starved afterward because he ate everything at once, overwhelmed his body, and collapsed. This story circulates in many Arctic cultures. Mainstream medicine supports it. Refeeding syndrome is real and dangerous. Historians still argue how often such cases occurred versus being cautionary tales. You don't want to test either theory. Hunger brings strange sensory shifts. Smells seem stronger, even imagined ones. You swear you catch a hint of smoke long after the fire is gone. You mention it softly. The widow listens, then shakes her head. Not real. Good that you checked. Hallucinations don't always announce themselves. Questioning perception is a survival skill. Your stomach tightens again, but less urgently. The food has done its work even in small quantity. Blood sugar steadies. Thought sharpens slightly. You take stock. Fingers responsive, toes warm enough, breath even. Hunger hasn't won, but it hasn't left either. It waits. Joke number 2 surfaces as you realize how politely hunger behaves compared to movies. No growling, no drama, just passive-aggressive silence. You almost laugh, then remember restraint. Energy conserved is energy earned. The widow explains that hunger changes decision-making more than people realize. Hungry minds choose speed over safety, action over reflection. This is documented in modern behavioral science, but Arctic people learned it empirically. They built rules to slow themselves down, rituals, pauses, shared meals. Structure counters impulse. She asks you to describe tomorrow not in detail, just in intention. You say you'll wait for light, reassess, move carefully. Saying it out loud anchors it. Hunger thrives on uncertainty. Plans, even tentative ones, starve it of leverage. Outside, the night remains still. Wolves do not return. Wind brushes the shelter lightly, like a test. You feel more present now, less floaty. Food has reconnected you to the moment. Joke number 3 arrives gently, almost kindly. Hunger is the only enemy that negotiates if you treat it right. You let the thought settle. Feels true. Historians still argue whether starvation was the silent killer of Arctic history, overshadowed by more dramatic deaths from exposure. Reading old accounts, they note how often people simply lay down after long hunger. Sitting here, you understand how that happens. Not as surrender, but as miscalculation. The widow offers one final bite before tucking the food away. Not because you need it now, but because the body remembers patterns. Ending on nourishment, however small, reassures it. You chew slowly, deliberately, imprinting the act. As the long night continues, hunger remains. A low hum rather than a scream. You've acknowledged it, managed it, kept it from steering. That matters more than fullness ever could. You settle back into stillness, body and mind aligned just enough. In the Arctic, that balance between need and restraint, between appetite and awareness, is what keeps people alive when nothing else will. Cold injuries do not announce themselves with pain. That is the first mistake people make when imagining them. Pain is loud, urgent, impossible to ignore. The Arctic prefers subtlety. Cold injuries arrive as absence of sensation, of urgency, of concern. You don't feel hurt. You feel fine. And that is precisely the danger. The widow watches your hands more than your face. Faces lie. Hands tell the truth. Fingers stiffen before minds do. She asks you to move them slowly, one by one. You obey. The motion feels clumsy, delayed, as though your thoughts arrive before your muscles catch up. This lag is small, but it matters. She explains quietly that frostbite rarely begins with agony. It begins with numbness and color change. White skin means circulation has already retreated. Red skin means it is fighting to return. Either way, damage is possible. In historical accounts, people often realized they were injured only after warmth returned, and with it, pain that felt disproportionate, almost unfair. You look at your fingers. They seem normal enough. Pale, perhaps, but the light is poor. The widow does not rely on sight alone. She presses gently, watches how quickly color returns. This technique appears in modern medical triage, but here it's ancestral. Time is tissue. Cold injuries are deceptive because they don't always worsen linearly. A hand can feel numb for hours, then suddenly decline when conditions change. Wind picks up, fatigue deepens, hunger resurfaces. Survivors wrote about this unpredictability with frustration. Historians still argue whether this randomness was exaggerated by memory, but modern physiology confirms that peripheral circulation is fragile under stress. You rub your hands together slowly, not aggressively, Too much friction can damage already compromised skin. Gentle movement encourages blood flow without shock. The widow nods. She reminds you that sudden heat, placing frozen hands near fire, can cause severe tissue damage. This knowledge appears in both Inuit oral tradition and 20th century medical manuals. Different paths, same conclusion. Your feet are next. Boots off would be ideal but impossible right now. Exposure would cost more than inspection would gain. Instead, you wiggle toes, flex ankles. The movement is reassuring. Sensation remains. For now, cold injuries are not limited to extremities. The nose, ears, cheeks, anything exposed is vulnerable. The widow adjusts your scarf slightly, redirecting airflow. She has learned how wind sculpts cold, how it finds seams in clothing and patience. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition refined over generations. There's a psychological component too. Cold dulls concern. People stop checking themselves. They stop caring. This apathy is dangerous. In historical journals, explorers wrote about companions who refused help, insisting they were fine, while tissue quietly died. Modern researchers attribute this to cold-induced cognitive narrowing. Out here, it's simply known. You take inventory again. Breath steady. Heart rate slow. No shivering at the moment. Shivering is the body's emergency generator, inefficient, exhausting, but effective. Its absence can mean either stability or failure. Context decides. Right now, stability seems more likely. The widow tells you about a man who lost 3 fingers without realizing it. He felt no pain until days later. When sensation returned, it returned as fire. Surgeons today call this reperfusion injury. The Arctic calls it the bill coming due. Historians still argue how often such injuries led to death versus disability. But the scars remain in museum collections and old photographs. Joke number 1 drifts in softly. Cold injuries are like bad guests. They don't knock, they just rearrange the furniture and leave you to discover it later. The thought is oddly comforting. Humor reframes threat into something manageable. You focus on prevention rather than fear. Prevention is active, fear is draining. Small movements, periodic checks, shared observation. The widow insists on mutual monitoring. You check her, she checks you. This reciprocity matters. People are notoriously bad at judging their own decline. Cold also affects joints. Stiffness creeps in, reducing mobility and increasing injury risk. You rotate shoulders slowly, stretch neck gently. The motions feel deliberate, ritualistic. Rituals create rhythm. Rhythm resists panic. There's a sound outside. A soft crack, perhaps ice shifting. You tense instinctively, then relax. Tension burns energy and restricts blood flow. The widow notices and murmurs a reminder to release. Even emotion management is part of injury prevention. Cold injuries whisper before they shout. Tingling can precede numbness, but not always. Sometimes there is nothing at all. This unpredictability is why Arctic cultures developed redundant safeguards, layers of clothing, layers of behavior, layers of social oversight. One system fails, another compensates. You think of modern winter sports enthusiasts, their bright gear and emergency beacons. Technology helps, but it doesn't replace vigilance. Out here, vigilance is the technology. Joke number 2 appears. Dry as the air. Frostbite is the only injury where, I didn't feel a thing, is the opposite of good news. You almost smile. The widow explains that sleep complicates everything. During sleep, movement decreases, circulation slows, and awareness vanishes. Many cold injuries occur not during activity, but during rest. This is why Arctic sleep strategies emphasize insulation, shared warmth, and periodic waking. Sleep must be negotiated with cold, not surrendered to it. You adjust position slightly, redistributing pressure. Pressure points reduce blood flow. Even small shifts help. This knowledge appears in nursing textbooks and nomadic practice alike. Bodies remember what works. Your ears feel fine, but you cover them anyway. Wind is opportunistic. It waits. The widow tells you that some injuries occur only when conditions improve, when wind dies and humidity rises, accelerating heat loss. Counterintuitive but documented. The Arctic delights in exceptions. Another check. Fingers still responsive. Toes cooperative. Face warm enough. You note it without celebration. Complacency is premature. Joke number 3 settles in gently. Surviving the cold is less about bravery and more about nagging yourself constantly. You accept this. Nagging is underrated. Historians still debate how much Arctic survival depended on physiology versus culture. Sitting here, the distinction feels artificial. Culture shapes behavior. Behavior protects physiology. The widow's knowledge is not abstract. It is embodied, tested, refined. Cold injuries, left unmanaged, cascade. A numb finger leads to clumsiness, clumsiness leads to drop tools lead to exposure. The chain is cruelly logical. Breaking it early is essential. You think about tomorrow again briefly. Light will help. Visual inspection will be easier. Movement will be safer. For now, maintenance is the goal. Hold the line. The night deepens, but your awareness does not fade. Not entirely. You remain present, scanning gently, without strain. This balance, alert but calm, is rare and precious. The widow settles into stillness too. Her breathing slows. She trusts the systems in place. Trust does not mean ignorance. It means confidence earned through repetition. Cold injuries remain a possibility, hovering like a shadow at the edge of the firelight. But they have not crossed the threshold. You have watched, adjusted, responded. That is enough for now. As you rest, you understand something quietly profound. In the Arctic, survival is not a single heroic act. It is 1,000 small corrections made patiently, while nothing dramatic happens. And when nothing dramatic happens, you are still alive. Night stretches here in a way that feels deliberate, almost personal. Not the gentle dark you know from city evenings, but a sustained absence of light that presses against your thoughts. You notice it not with fear, but with a slow recalibration of time. Minutes feel elastic. Hours feel optional. Without sunrise or sunset, your mind searches for other anchors. You sit quietly, listening to the faint rhythm of breathing, yours, the widow's, the soft crackle of a fire that seems more symbolic than powerful. In polar darkness, sound becomes a clock. Each small noise marks continuity. Silence, paradoxically, becomes loud. The widow once tells you that people underestimate how darkness alters judgment. You nod because you already feel it. Decisions feel heavier. Choices demand more effort. Modern neuroscience agrees. Extended darkness disrupts circadian rhythms, alters melatonin production, and affects mood and cognition. This is not weakness. It is biology responding to an unfamiliar environment. Historically, Arctic peoples adapted by restructuring daily life. Instead of aligning tasks with daylight, they aligned them with necessity and ritual. Storytelling filled the void left by the sun. It provided structure, memory, and reassurance. Anthropologists note that winter storytelling traditions were not merely entertainment, they were survival tools. Historians still argue whether these narratives primarily preserved knowledge or primarily stabilized mental health. But the answer is likely both. Your thoughts drift inward more easily now. Memories surface uninvited. Not dramatic ones, mundane fragments. A room with warm light, the sound of water in pipes, the feeling of socks fresh from a dryer. You let these memories pass without clinging. Attachment drains energy. Darkness also sharpens imagination. Shapes outside the shelter feel more animated. The wind becomes intentional. The wolves, remember them, occupy more mental space than physical. This is normal. The brain, deprived of visual input, fills gaps creatively. Sometimes too creatively. Joke number 1 arrives softly. In total darkness, every shadow looks suspiciously like a wolf with opinions. You almost smile, then relax your jaw again. Smiling burns calories. You are learning restraint in strange places. The widow suggests a quiet mental exercise, naming familiar objects in sequence, describing them in detail. This technique appears in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, but she learned it without a name. Keeps the mind occupied without overstimulation. You describe a cup, a door, a window. Each imagined detail steadies you. Polar darkness also disrupts sleep architecture. People sleep longer but less deeply, or drift in and out unpredictably. Historical records from early Arctic expeditions describe men sleeping in fragments, waking unsure how long they had rested. Today, sleep researchers confirm that without light cues, the brain struggles to organize sleep cycles. You stop expecting normal sleep. Expectation breeds frustration. Instead, you rest when possible. You lie still, eyes closed, not demanding unconsciousness. Rest counts. This reframing is essential. Demanding sleep is like demanding warmth from the wind. There is a fringe belief, noted in some Siberian oral traditions, that extended darkness allows the boundary between waking and dreaming to thin. People reported vivid waking visions, not hallucinations exactly, but heightened imagery. Modern psychology would attribute this to sensory deprivation. The tradition treats it with respect rather than alarm. Acknowledge, don't chase. You notice your internal monologue slowing. Thoughts lengthen. Sentences stretch. This can feel unsettling if resisted. If accepted, it becomes meditative. The Arctic rewards surrender, but punishes complacency. A delicate balance. Joke number 2 surfaces. Polar night is what happens when the universe forgets to pay the electricity bill. You let the thought drift away before it invites a sequel. Darkness also amplifies sound directionality. You can't see movement, so your ears work harder. This constant vigilance is tiring. The widow suggests alternating focus, listening intently for a few minutes, then consciously relaxing. Muscles follow attention. Attention follows intention. Mainstream historical fact slips in quietly. During the 19th century, European explorers in the Arctic reported higher rates of depression and conflict during polar night than during extreme cold. The darkness, not the temperature, strained morale most. Some expeditions implemented mandatory social routines, shared meals, lectures, even amateur theater, to combat the psychological toll. Light was scarce. Structure was not. You feel gratitude for the widow's presence. Solitude magnifies darkness. Companionship diffuses it. Even silent company matters. Two nervous systems regulate each other. Your sense of self feels different now. Less defined by plans, more by sensations. Warmth, hunger, fatigue. The Arctic reduces identity to essentials. This can be frightening or clarifying. There's a moment when you think you see movement beyond the shelter. You pause. Listen. Nothing follows. You do not escalate. This restraint is learned. Reacting to every imagined threat exhausts the mind. Joke number 3 tiptoes in. In the dark, the scariest thing is your own brain auditioning for a horror movie it didn't rehearse for. You acknowledge it, then redirect. Historians still debate whether prolonged darkness altered Arctic belief systems, whether spirits, myths, and cosmologies intensified during winter months. Some argue that darkness shaped spirituality. Others argue spirituality shaped endurance of darkness. Sitting here, the argument feels academic. What matters is that meaning fills the void light leaves behind. You recall the widow mentioning that children were taught early not to fear the dark, but to respect it. Fear consumes energy. Respect guides behavior. This distinction feels important. Your breathing deepens again. You synchronize with the quiet. The wolves remain outside your mental perimeter now, less vivid. The darkness feels less hostile, more neutral. Not an enemy, just a condition. Time passes, or maybe it doesn't. The distinction blurs. You mark progress not by hours, but by checks. Fingers, toes, breath, fire. All acceptable. Good enough is perfect here. Eventually, you realize something subtle. The darkness no longer demands your attention. It has become background. This is adaptation in real time. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just functional. As you rest, the Arctic night continues its long, patient watch. It does not hurry you. It does not reassure you. It simply exists. And for now, so do you, aware, calm, and quietly resilient. At some point, fear changes texture. It stops being sharp and starts becoming informational. That is where you find yourself now. observing the wolves not as monsters, but as neighbors whose routines intersect with yours. The yellow eyes you imagined earlier have softened into shapes, then into patterns. Patterns can be learned. You hear them before you see them. A low movement in the snow. A brief, almost conversational sound. More breath than growl. Wolves conserve energy. They do not announce themselves unless necessary. This alone contradicts most popular myths, which paint them as reckless or aggressive. In reality, wolves are economical to a fault. The widow does not reach for a weapon. That detail matters. Her stillness tells you more than any lecture. She listens, evaluates, waits. This behavior aligns with historical accounts from Siberian and Arctic communities, which describe wolves as cautious observers rather than relentless attackers. Documented wolf attacks on humans in Yakutia are rare and usually linked to disease or extreme scarcity. You remember a mainstream historical fact. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Russian fur traders in Yakutia recorded that wolves followed camps at a distance, waiting for scraps rather than confrontation. Wolves learned human schedules, learned which camps were worth monitoring. This is not predation. This is opportunism. The widow explains softly that wolves are curious about human presence, especially in winter. A stationary camp is an anomaly in a landscape of movement. They watch to understand, not to attack. Historians still argue whether this proximity influenced early domestication myths or reinforced boundaries between wild and human space. You shift slightly, and the sound stops. Stillness resumes. The wolves have registered the movement. They adjust. This mutual awareness creates a kind of unspoken negotiation. You are not prey. You are not competition. You are simply there. Joke number 1 arrives gently. Wolves are like neighbors who don't knock. Just stand across the street, pretending they're not watching your lights. The thought diffuses tension without dismissing reality. The widow tells you that eye contact matters. Staring can be interpreted as challenge. Ignoring entirely can signal vulnerability. The balance is awareness without fixation. This nuance appears in modern wildlife guidelines, but here it's instinctive. Wolves also read body language. Upright posture communicates health and confidence. Slumped posture suggests weakness. This is not anthropomorphism. It's pattern recognition across species. Hunters learned this long before ethologists named it. You notice how the wolves maintain distance, never crossing an invisible line. That line is cultural as much as spatial. Generations of interaction have taught them what humans represent. Risk, unpredictability, occasional reward. Not worth gambling on without cause. There is a fringe belief among some Yakut storytellers that wolves can sense illness in humans. Modern science would interpret this as sensitivity to movement, smell, and behavior changes. The belief persists not because it is mystical, but because it feels true in practice. You consider your own condition. Tired, yes. Weak, no. Joke number 2 sneaks in. Wolves can smell fear, but unfortunately they can also smell frozen socks, and that's probably worse. You breathe through your nose, then stop. Cold air. The widow gestures subtly toward the fire. Maintaining light matters. Not as a deterrent, wolves are not afraid of fire per se, but as a signal of presence. Presence reduces ambiguity. Ambiguity invites investigation. You recall another historical note. During polar expeditions, camps that maintained consistent light and sound reported fewer close animal encounters. Silence and darkness made camps blend into the environment. Visibility established boundaries. The wolves shift position. You hear snow compress under careful pause. They are circling at a respectful distance. Mapping. This mapping is not malicious. It is survival. Understanding this reframes the encounter from threat to coexistence. Your heart rate remains steady. This is important. Sudden movement or panic would escalate the situation. Calm communicates control. Joke number 3 floats in. If wolves wanted to eat you, they'd have done it by now, and you wouldn't be narrating this part. You let the humor pass without tempting fate. Historians still debate how often wolves actively assisted human survival indirectly, by clearing carrion, by keeping other scavengers away, by signaling environmental changes. Some argue wolves functioned as early warning systems. Others dismiss this as romanticism. Sitting here, you wonder if the truth lies quietly between. The widow tells you that wolves sometimes lead hunters to prey unintentionally, their movement patterns revealing migration paths. This knowledge was passed down, not written. It required patience, observation, humility. You realize that fear dissolves fastest when replaced with understanding. The wolves are no longer symbols of doom. They are animals doing what animals do. This does not make them harmless, but it makes them predictable. Predictability is comfort. The darkness remains, but it feels less crowded now. The presence outside does not press in. It exists parallel to you, not against you. Eventually, the sounds fade. The wolves move on, perhaps disappointed, perhaps satisfied with their assessment. Either way, the encounter ends without drama. That, you realize, is the most common outcome. As quiet returns, you reflect on how narratives exaggerate danger because fear is memorable. Calm success rarely makes stories, but calm success is what keeps people alive. You settle back into stillness. The widow resumes her quiet watch. Trust deepens not just between you and her, but between you and the environment. Not trust that nothing bad will happen, but trust that you can respond if it does. The Arctic night continues. Wolves pass through it. So do you. For now, your paths intersect only briefly, respectfully, and then diverge again, each returning to your own version of survival. Injuries from cold do not always arrive as damage. Sometimes they arrive as permission. Permission to stop feeling, to slow down, to let small systems fail quietly while the larger one keeps going. This is why exhaustion in the Arctic is so dangerous. It disguises itself as calm. You feel it now. Not dramatic fatigue, but a soft heaviness behind the eyes. Your limbs respond, but with a fraction more delay than before. This is the stage where mistakes begin to breed. The widow notices before you do. She always does. She encourages movement. Not vigorous, just enough to remind muscles of their job. A shift of weight, a roll of shoulders. The goal is circulation, not warmth. Warmth follows circulation, not the other way around. This principle appears in modern cold weather training manuals, but it has been practiced here for centuries. Cold injuries also arrive through repetition. Small exposures, repeated over time, accumulate. This cumulative effect was poorly understood by early explorers, who assumed damage occurred only during extremes. Historians still argue whether expedition failures were caused more by acute storms or by chronic microexposures that eroded resilience quietly. You flex your fingers again. They respond, but feel thick, as though wrapped in layers of thought. You accept the sensation without alarm. Panic accelerates exhaustion. Calm preserves margin. The widow speaks of frostnip, a mild, reversible cold injury often ignored. Skin pales, tingles, then recovers if addressed early. Many survivors lost tissue not because of frostbite itself, but because they dismissed frostnip repeatedly until recovery was no longer possible. This distinction matters. Language shapes response. Mainstream historical fact slides in. During World War II, military studies on cold injuries revealed that troops who rotated duties and monitored each other had dramatically lower injury rates than those who relied on individual endurance. Team awareness outperformed toughness. The Arctic has always known this. You glance at the fire. It has shrunk slightly. Fuel is finite. Decisions must account for tomorrow. This constant calculation, spend now or save later, adds cognitive load. Cognitive load accelerates fatigue. Fatigue invites mistakes. The cycle is tight and unforgiving. Joke number 1 drifts through. The Arctic doesn't kill you by yelling. It bores you into making bad decisions. You nod internally. Boredom is underrated as a threat. Your breathing remains steady, but shallower. Shallow breathing reduces oxygenation, which compounds fatigue. You consciously deepen a few breaths, then let them settle. Too much control becomes strain. Balance again. The widow mentions that people often underestimate how cold affects sleep debt. You may rest, but without true restorative sleep, debt accumulates. This debt manifests as slowed reaction time, impaired judgment, and emotional flattening. Modern sleep science confirms this. The Arctic simply demonstrates it more efficiently. There's also the phenomenon of paradoxical warmth, the false sensation of heat that can precede hypothermia. Victims sometimes remove clothing, misled by their own nervous systems. This is rare but documented. The widow watches for signs. You watch for them too. Shared vigilance. Joke number 2 tiptoes in. If your brain suddenly says, "I'm fine, let's nap forever," that's not enlightenment. That's a system error. You mentally flag the thought. Exhaustion also narrows focus. Tunnel vision develops. Peripheral awareness fades. This is dangerous in a dynamic environment. The widow encourages periodic wide scans, turning your head slowly, acknowledging space. This simple act re-engages spatial processing. You feel hunger again, faint but persistent. Calories are insulation. Without them, the body burns itself to stay warm. Historical accounts emphasize fat consumption in cold climates for this reason. Lean protein alone is insufficient. Fat fuels endurance. The widow shares a fringe tidbit. Some Arctic groups believed exhaustion could be warded off by rhythmic chanting, not for spiritual reasons, but to regulate breathing and movement. Modern physiology would recognize this as entrainment. The belief persists because it works. You hum quietly, almost unconsciously. The vibration is grounding. Sound anchors you in your body. Historians still debate whether early Arctic survival knowledge was more intuitive or experimental. Did people test methods deliberately, or did they stumble upon them through lived experience? Sitting here, the distinction feels blurred. Experience is a form of experiment, repeated until it stops failing. Your joints ache slightly now, not pain, just awareness. Awareness is acceptable. Pain demands action. You adjust posture again, relieving pressure points. Small corrections accumulate into survival. Joke number 3 arrives gently. In the Arctic, the most dangerous thought is, "I'll fix that later," because later is expensive. You commit to addressing discomfort early. The widow prepares for brief sleep. Not deep, not long. She will wake often. You will too. This fragmented rest is not ideal, but it is sufficient. Sufficient is the goal. As you settle, you understand that cold injuries and exhaustion are not enemies that charge. They are negotiations you must continually renegotiate. Terms change. Attention must adapt. Your eyelids grow heavy, but your awareness remains like a low flame, not bright, but persistent. You do not chase sleep. You allow it to approach if it wishes. Outside, the Arctic remains indifferent. Inside, systems hum, strained but functioning. You are tired, yes, but not compromised. Not yet. For now, that distinction holds. And in the Arctic, holding the line is everything. You sense the change before you see it. The storm does not end dramatically. It loosens its grip. The wind drops a register, from a constant roar to something intermittent, almost conversational. Snow still falls, but the flakes feel lighter, less aggressive. The Arctic rarely announces mercy. It simply eases pressure and waits to see what you do with it. This is the most dangerous moment, when survival shifts from endurance to decision-making. The widow knows it. You know it too. Movement after confinement carries risk. Muscles cooled by stillness resist sudden effort. Judgment, dulled by fatigue, can misread opportunity as safety. You sit quietly, listening to the altered rhythm of the world. Sound travels differently now. Distances feel longer. Space reasserts itself. This is not dawn, light remains absent. But the storm's personality has changed. That matters. Mainstream historical fact enters softly. Many Arctic travel fatalities occurred not during storms, but immediately after, when survivors attempted to move too quickly. Historical expedition logs are filled with phrases like, "believed conditions had improved," and "decided to press on." Historians still argue whether these decisions were rational gambles or cognitive errors born of relief. The widow insists on patience. She wants to confirm stability, not just improvement. She checks the fire, the shelter, your condition. You mirror her movements. Mutual confirmation reduces bias. Your body feels stiff now. When you stand, the motion is deliberate, segmented. You allow joints to wake slowly. Blood redistributes with a faint tingling. This is acceptable. Sharp pain would not be. Joke number 1 appears cautiously. The Arctic loves people who say, "Just one more step," because it charges interest. You respect the humor without tempting it. You step outside briefly, shielded just enough to assess. Visibility has improved marginally. Wind no longer scours skin instantly. These are signals, not guarantees. You do not travel yet. You observe. The widow scans the ground. Snow has drifted, reshaping landmarks. What was flat is now uneven. What was sheltered may now funnel wind. Movement must account for this new geometry. There is also the matter of wolves. You listen. Nothing. Their absence suggests they have moved on, perhaps tracking prey disturbed by the storm. This reduces one variable, but not all. You feel a cautious optimism rising. Optimism must be managed. Can motivate or mislead. The widow tempers it with logistics. Where would you go? How far? With what margin? Historians still debate how ancient Arctic travelers navigated post-storm landscapes without fixed markers. Some argue they relied on subtle snow textures and wind patterns. Others suggest memorized terrain played a larger role. Likely both. You lack that depth of familiarity. Caution increases. Joke number 2 drifts in. If the Arctic gives you a window, it's usually a basement window. You nod internally. Windows can close. You prepare slowly. Clothing adjusted. Boots checked. Layers redistributed. Moisture managed. Sweat is dangerous now. You aim for warmth, not heat. This nuance appears in modern cold weather doctrine, but it's intuitive when consequences are immediate. Your breath fogs faintly. You note it. Breath visibility can indicate humidity and temperature shifts. Small data points accumulate. The widow explains that walking out alive often depends on timing more than strength. Leave too early, you meet residual chaos. Leave too late, daylight or what passes for it slips away. Timing is a skill, not a guess. You wait. Minutes pass. Conditions hold. This consistency matters more than improvement. Consistency suggests a trend. Joke number 3 arrives softly. In survival, impatience is just panic wearing a watch. You let the thought settle. Finally, the decision is made not to escape fully but to reposition. A modest goal. Reach a known landmark. Reestablish orientation. Success is incremental. You move together, steps synchronized. This reduces energy expenditure and simplifies monitoring. If one falters, the other notices immediately. The landscape feels unfamiliar, but not hostile. Snow crunches underfoot with a different pitch. Wind brushes rather than bites. You remain alert, but not tense. Fatigue lingers. You pace accordingly. Short steps. Regular pauses. During each pause, you check in hands, feet, breath, mind. This ritual anchors you. Historians still argue whether early Arctic survivors conceptualized journeys as linear paths or as sequences of safe states. Right now, you favor the latter. Reach stability, then reassess. You reach the landmark. A dark shape half buried. Familiar enough. Relief surfaces, then is contained. Relief can soften edges too quickly. You stop. Shelter remains viable here. You have improved position without overextending. This is success. The widow nods once. Approval without celebration. Celebration spends energy. You settle again, preparing for the next phase. The storm may return. Or not. Either way, you are better placed than before. As you rest, you understand that walking out alive is rarely a dramatic march into freedom. It is a careful series of decisions that avoid catastrophe by refusing to rush. The Arctic allows survival not to the boldest, but to the most attentive. Tonight, attention has been enough. Morning is a concept more than a condition here. Light does not arrive with ceremony. It seeps. The darkness thins just enough to suggest depth in the landscape again. Shadows separate from snow. Distance returns. You feel this shift before you consciously register it, like a room slowly filling with breath. You wake not refreshed, but functional. That is victory. The widow is already awake. She always is. Experience trains the body to wake before danger does. The cold feels different now. Not warmer exactly, just less aggressive. Wind has slackened. Snow rests instead of moving. These are subtle changes, but they matter. The Arctic communicates in margins. You stretch slowly, testing joints. Stiffness remains, but no sharp pain. Fingers respond. Toes complain, then comply. You take inventory without ceremony. Everything works well enough. Mainstream historical fact surfaces gently. Many Arctic survivors describe the morning after a storm as the most psychologically relieving moment of their ordeal, even if conditions remained severe. Any light restored orientation and morale. This effect is well documented in expedition journals. The widow suggests moving while conditions hold. Windows do not last. You prepare again, more confidently now, but not carelessly. Confidence must remain conditional. You step out, and the landscape feels altered, but readable. Snowdrifts reveal wind direction history. Subtle ridges suggest safer footing. You begin to see the terrain as a map again, not a void. Joke number 1 appears quietly. In the Arctic, morning doesn't say good morning. It just nods and expects you to keep up. You appreciate the understatement. You move steadily, conserving energy. Each step is measured. You avoid deep drifts, favoring compacted snow. The widow points out a faint depression, a previous path nearly erased. This knowledge comes from decades of watching snow behave. You think of the Yakut widow's ancestors, traveling these lands without GPS, without forecasts. Navigation relied on memory, stars, wind, and instinct. Historians still debate how much of this skill was taught versus absorbed through observation. Likely both. Children learned by being present. You pause occasionally, scanning for wildlife. Wolves are absent. Birds too. Silence dominates. This can indicate stability or emptiness. You treat it as neutral. Fatigue remains your constant companion, but it no longer feels heavy. Feels managed. This distinction matters. Managed fatigue allows function. Unmanaged fatigue erodes judgment. Joke number 2 drifts in. Survival walking is just hiking with lower expectations and higher consequences. You suppress a smile and keep moving. You feel hunger again, sharper now. The body knows effort is returning. Calories will be needed. You plan accordingly, rationing without obsession. Balance again. The widow shares a small, quirky tidbit. Some Arctic travelers carried smooth stones in their pockets to grip during long walks, a tactile anchor against dissociation. Modern psychology would call this grounding. The stones remain in museum collections, polished by anxiety and time. Historians still argue whether such practices were symbolic or practical. Sitting here, you see no difference. The path ahead opens slightly. Terrain flattens. Movement becomes easier. You do not accelerate. You maintain rhythm. You think briefly of the wolves again, not with fear, but with curiosity. Where are they now? Following prey. Resting? Their absence feels appropriate. This is human movement time. Joke number 3 arrives softly. Wolves respect schedules better than most people. You file that away. As hours pass, light strengthens marginally. Not brightness, clarity. Edges sharpen. You can judge distance more accurately. This reduces mental strain. Your breathing remains steady. Your posture upright. These are signs of recovery, not safety. You remain vigilant. The widow stops suddenly, gestures. Ahead, a familiar marker, perhaps a tree line, perhaps a ridge you recognize from before the storm. Recognition triggers relief, then caution. Familiarity can breed haste. You approach carefully. Yes, it is what you thought. Orientation restored. Options expand. You pause again, letting the moment settle. Survival is not just physical. It is psychological integration. You need to absorb progress without letting it distort judgment. Historians still debate whether Arctic survival narratives emphasize suffering too heavily, overshadowing competence and adaptation. Standing here, you feel the truth lean toward competence. Suffering happened, yes, but it was met with skill. You prepare for the next phase. Longer travel, perhaps assistance, perhaps known shelter. The widow leads. You follow. Roles are clear. As you move forward, you carry more than fatigue and hunger. You carry lessons. Small ones. Quiet ones. The kind that don't announce themselves. The Arctic recedes slightly, not in threat, but in immediacy. It remains powerful, but you are no longer at its mercy. You are engaged in a dialogue now. And for the first time since the storm began, you allow yourself to believe. Not that everything will be fine, but that you can handle what comes next. That belief is not optimism. It is earned calm. What the cold leaves behind is not obvious at first. It is tempting to think survival ends when danger fades, when movement becomes easier, when landmarks return. But the Arctic's final lesson arrives quietly, after urgency loosens its grip. It arrives in reflection. You walk now with steadier rhythm. Not fast, not slow, appropriate. The widow sets the pace and you match it. There is no conversation. Words feel unnecessary. Silence no longer presses. It accompanies. Your body still carries fatigue, but it is no longer threatening. Muscles ache with purpose, not alarm. This distinction matters. Pain that signals damage demands attention. Pain that signals recovery can be tolerated. Mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Many Arctic survivors reported that the psychological impact of extreme cold lingered longer than physical injuries. Even after reaching safety, they described heightened vigilance, altered sleep, and a lasting respect for environmental limits. Modern psychology recognizes this as adaptive recalibration rather than trauma in every case. You understand that now. Your awareness feels sharpened, not broken. You notice small things, the texture of snow underfoot, the sound of breath inside layers, the way light shifts across ice. Attention has been retrained. The widow slows and gestures toward the horizon. A destination is implied. Not necessarily rescue, perhaps familiarity, perhaps community. Either way, you are no longer improvising blindly. You are navigating. Joke number 1 appears softly. Surviving the Arctic doesn't make you fearless. It just makes your fear more selective. You agree. You think again of the wolves. Not as threats, but as part of the system that shaped you these past days. They forced awareness. They demanded respect. In doing so, they clarified boundaries. Historians still debate whether human fear of wolves was ever justified at scale, but culturally, that fear served a function. It kept people attentive. The widow's presence has changed you too. Her calm, her economy of movement, her refusal to dramatize. These qualities proved more powerful than strength. You consider how many survival stories focus on individual heroism, overlooking quiet competence. This story feels different. As you move, you reflect on what nearly went wrong. Not in panic, but in analysis. Moments where impatience could have cost you, where comfort might have tempted risk. Learning consolidates now. Joke number 2 drifts in. The Arctic is an excellent teacher because it doesn't give extra credit. You file that away. You realize that survival was not a single decision, but a chain of them, each small, each reversible until it wasn't. This chain was managed through attention, not bravery. The landscape opens further. Familiar contours emerge. You feel something like closure approaching, though you do not name it. Naming can be premature. Historians still argue whether Arctic cultures emphasized endurance or adaptation more strongly. Endurance implies suffering through. Adaptation implies changing how you engage. Sitting here, the answer feels clear. Endurance alone exhausts. Adaptation preserves. Joke number 3 arrives gently. Surviving the cold teaches you that toughing it out is just stubbornness with better marketing. You allow yourself a quiet smile. The widow stops one last time, turns slightly toward you. There is no speech, no ceremony, just a shared understanding that this chapter is closing. The environment has not been conquered. It has been negotiated with successfully. You take one more mental inventory. Hands intact, feet functional, mind clear, memory rich. That last part surprises you. You will remember this not as terror, but as clarity. As you continue forward, The Arctic recedes into context rather than threat. It remains vast, indifferent, powerful. But you are no longer small within it. You are proportional. What the cold leaves behind is discipline, tension, respect, a quieter relationship with risk. These are not dramatic souvenirs, but they endure. You walk on, carrying these lessons lightly. The widow leads you toward whatever comes next. And you follow not because you are afraid, but because you have learned when to listen. The pace slows now. You feel the ground steady beneath you, no longer demanding constant negotiation. Your breathing evens out, deeper, softer, as if the body is finally allowed to exhale fully. The tension you didn't realize you were carrying begins to dissolve, not all at once, but in layers, shoulders first, then jaw, then the small muscles around the eyes. The Arctic fades into a memory space rather than an immediate presence. Snow becomes scenery instead of instruction. Cold becomes a sensation, not a warning. You are safe enough to stop scanning, safe enough to let your thoughts stretch and loosen. You remember the widow's calm, the wolf's distance, the long, dark hours that no longer feel endless. They settle into you like a low, steady hum, present, but no longer demanding attention. These memories don't jolt, they soothe. Your body grows heavier in a pleasant way now. Not exhaustion, but gravity reclaiming you. Muscles that worked so carefully are allowed to rest. The rhythm of walking, of breathing, of simply being alive becomes hypnotic. If your eyes close for a moment, that's fine. Nothing needs to be solved anymore. Nothing needs to be watched. The environment no longer asks questions of you. Let the images soften. Let the edges blur. Let the cold become distant, like weather you once knew but no longer stand inside. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. You have done enough. And as your thoughts slow, drifting gently, you can allow yourself to rest. Knowing that the night has passed, the lesson remains, and sleep can finally arrive without negotiation.